Greetings, my name is John Harris. I'm a faculty member of the Regional and City Planning Program at the University of Oklahoma. This video is part of a larger tribal climate change planning initiative. It will discuss important concepts for regional climate change vulnerability assessment and planning. We're learning from 5 cases where Oklahoma-based tribes internally assessed their own vulnerability to future climate change projections. This video is intended to provide information to the public as well as other tribes about the importance of climate vulnerability assessments, as well as discuss some of the more significant themes that came from the 5 projects. This project has been made possible through a grant by the Bureau of Indian Affairs Southern Plains Regional Office, working with University of Oklahoma's Regional and City Planning Program and the South Central Climate Science Center. The 5 tribes that were involved include the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, the Otoe-Missouri tribe, Fort Sill Apache, the Wichita and affiliated tribes, and the Kaw Nation. And all 5 tribes are part of the Oklahoma portion of the Southern Plains Regional Office of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In terms of contents of this presentation, after this brief introduction, we'll discuss what climate vulnerability assessments are and what they are intended to do. We'll discuss the climate projections for the Southern Plains region and discuss key concepts that arise from the 5 cases. After that, we'll discuss the actual 5 cases in terms of their specifics. At this time, we will discuss important ideas about climate vulnerability assessments, what they are, and how they're used. First of all, when we think of vulnerability, we have to think about what a community's exposure is to certain hazards. These hazards can be natural events like a flood, where a community would need to know how likely a flood event is in different parts of their community. We can also be talking about a human-caused event like a chemical spill. For both, when it comes to vulnerability, we want to know how likely the event is and what kinds of impacts a given event would have on a community. And then when we think of those impacts, we have to think about the physical vulnerabilities to a community's land, its structures, its infrastructure. But we also want to think about specific social vulnerabilities. For instance, are there certain populations within a community that are more vulnerable than others? This increased vulnerability could be because of where they reside or certain characteristics of that population, like age or economic status. In addition to vulnerability, we want to think about a community's adaptive capacity. This is an important idea. This means that when a community begins to think about their own hazard exposure to different events, they also begin to think through what options they have to reduce their vulnerability. So that as a community assesses its vulnerability, it also assesses its ability to cope and reduce risk and overall exposure. Essentially, we're talking about coping mechanisms. For instance, if a community were not found that it had increased exposure to certain emergency events, it might enter into a mutual aid agreement with the surrounding community, which would increase its ability to cope with that particular event. In this project, the methods for vulnerability analysis were taken largely from a document called Preparing for Climate Change. This document was prepared by the University of Washington and King County, Washington. These methods have been endorsed by the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals for use with tribal governments. In this document, it lays out processes for sitting down with tribal governments to assess what the organizational structure of the local government is doing and how those structures, those services, would be made vulnerable by a changing climate. After all 5 tribes completed their climate vulnerability assessment, it was important to compare those experiences to see if there were any larger lessons that could be articulated to other tribes in Oklahoma as well as the public at large. Here we want to discuss 6 ideas that came from these experiences. The first key concept is to underline the regional leadership of tribes in Oklahoma. Tribes in Oklahoma are often leaders in providing services not just to tribal citizens, but to non-tribal citizens alike. Also, tribes in Oklahoma are often some of the more forward-looking entities thinking about long-term regional needs and resources. When we take both of these ideas together, it means that tribes have great catalytic potential for regional impact when they think through their own vulnerabilities and what it might mean to reduce risk within the region. A second key concept is that while tribes are very often regional leaders, that the hazards confronting the tribes through climate change can only be tackled through regional interdependency. Many of the tribes identified ecological, resource, and disaster mitigation concerns for themselves and the region. However, these tend to be vulnerabilities that can only be addressed through regional partnerships. Therefore, the second key concept is that the hazards facing tribes through climate change underline the importance of working together with other regional actors. Many of these aspects include comprehensive water resource management, emergency preparedness, and the management of ecological resources together. The third key concept, after discussing regional interdependency, is thinking about internal interdependency within tribes. A thorough assessment of any tribe's vulnerability requires internal team building and cross-dialogue across all aspects of a tribe's operation. All the experiences of these cases show the need to break down silos within tribal organizations so that vulnerability assessment and planning can be most comprehensive. The fourth key concept involves internal capacity needs. Assessing threats from climate change require internal investments for monitoring conditions and ongoing adaptation planning. These investments are required so that tribes understand not only the current conditions of important ecological and cultural systems, but how those systems are changing over time. In addition, internal investments required for the adaptation capacity of the tribe's internal systems. The fifth key concept is that there are significant threats to the cultural heritage of Oklahoma tribes from climate change projections. Oklahoma tribes are already experiencing stress on their cultural heritage systems due to climate conditions, and the projected changes are going to bring even more stress, threatening ceremonial practices and the ongoing reproduction of cultural identity. This reality is complicated by the fact that the majority of Oklahoma-based tribes were relocated to Oklahoma from areas with significantly different climates. Therefore, many current cultural practices within the tribes are themselves already an adaptation to new conditions. The sixth key concept is that there is a set of regional climate threats that is common to almost all of the tribes involved in the project. When the tribes sat down to internally investigate threats and vulnerabilities, many of the same conditions were worrisome. These include the future supply of water resources for household consumption, firefighting, economic and agricultural production. Common concerns went beyond the supply of water to include the quality both of surface water and groundwater. Tribes were also concerned with increased threats from major storm events, such as flooding or tornadoes, or for extreme prolonged drought conditions. Along with that, most of the tribes were concerned with their ability to internally manage these kinds of emergency threats. We have just finished discussing key concepts for climate change vulnerability assessments, including the notion of hazard vulnerability itself and adaptive capacity. But in this case, all the hazards that we're referring to are specific to climate change projections for the region. So now we want to spend a little bit of time discussing those forecasts. All the information presented here is taken from the National Climate Assessment. More detailed information is available at the indicated website. The projections from the National Climate Assessment for Oklahoma include important ideas or details about increased temperatures and drought conditions. The image in front of you shows the projected number of increased hot days. In other words, the projections suggest that the temperature will increase in the Southern Plains region. Another way of thinking about that is if you think about the 7 hottest days of the year, this image indicates that those conditions are projected to increase from anywhere between 13 and 30 days. That is, the hottest conditions of the year could increase to 2 weeks to an entire month. All of this is indicated by mid-21st century. The next image shows a similar idea, but for warmer nights. So not only is the region projected to increase the number of warm days, but also the number of warm nights. Of course, this is important because it will impact agricultural systems as well as ground and surface water through increased evaporation and decreasing soil moisture. In addition to increasing warmth, both daytime and nighttime, the Southern Plains region is also expected to see an increase in the number of consecutive dry days. That is, by mid-21st century, many parts of Oklahoma could see dry conditions extended by a number of days over the same period. Taken together, when we discuss what we might consider the new normal for Oklahoma, is that by mid-21st century, we will be seeing an increased number of hot days and warm nights, and an increase in dry days. This is the background from which all 5 tribes discussed their own climate vulnerability. They thought through what this increase in temperature and increase in dry conditions would mean for all of the systems of the tribal organization. We will now present specific information from the 5 cases. I will present the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and the Fort Sill Apaches projects. Don Jordan will present the Otoe-Missouri tribe and the Kaw Nation, while Megan Wieters will present the Wichita and Affiliated Tribe project. Citizen Potawatomi Nation is located in Potawatomi and Cleveland counties. The goals of the project were to analyze the activities of the tribal governance structure and better understand the impact of climate change on those activities. In addition, the tribe wanted to understand better its adaptive capacity in terms of its ability to cope and create next steps to reduce the vulnerability of climate change impacts. Citizen Potawatomi Nation created a steering committee made up of agency heads and key informants from various levels of the tribal governance structure. The steering committee met numerous times in 2015 and 2016. In addition, the steering committee provided a number of important documents from the tribe to the Regional City Planning Program at the University of Oklahoma. The steering committee meetings and the documents were used to assess the tribe's vulnerability to climate change projections. One key aspect of the steering committee's activities was to assess the threats of climate change to cultural resources. The Citizen Potawatomi Nation are originally from the Great Lakes. Therefore, it's important to understand that climate change in Oklahoma is not the only threat to the tribe, but as the climate changes in the Great Lakes, this represents threats to important cultural resources, including various plant and animal species that are important for ceremonies. Climate change projections suggest that current ecological conditions are under threat. Also, the drought and heat increases will impact the ability of the tribe to use fire within its ceremonies. In terms of adaptive capacity, the tribe's cultural resources staff are working hard to increase the ability to source resources from other regions through an inter-Potawatomi organization of affiliated Potawatomi tribes. Also, as the tribe considers expanding its current fire prevention and management strategies, it will also include greater levels of education for tribal citizens on how to safely practice tribal traditions with the use of fire during drought and heat events. Tribal staff have already begun the process of collecting heirloom seeds and reproducing important species through community garden projects. The Citizen Potawatomi Nation is a regional leader in its emergency management response systems. However, the tribe is already experiencing stresses related to the costs of emergency management response and acknowledges that increased preparedness will require increased investment. As a regional leader, Citizen Potawatomi Nation often comes to the aid of other regional entities that are experiencing emergency management situations. But as such, these agreements are not formal, and so the tribe may consider entering into more formal mutual aid agreements in the coming years. Of particular concern to the steering committee was flood management. Many of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation's assets exist in the current floodplain. Thus, as flooding threats increase in the region, so too do the threats to the main tribal complex and several of the important tribal buildings. Flood management is a prime concern for all aspects of the tribal governance, and they are in the midst of or have completed several recent projects that limit their exposure to the flood threat. That said, the steering committee acknowledges that in the future, more investments will be required to minimize the threat of flooding at the main tribal complex and several of its economic development land uses. As mentioned before, Citizen Potawatomi Nation is considering an increase in its ability to tackle wildfire threats throughout the area. However, given the rural nature of most of the nation's lands, the costs of fire response are quite considerable. Given the projected increase in fire threats, Citizen Potawatomi Nation acknowledges that likely to tackle this threat, it will require increased budgets, public education programs, a controlled burn system, as well as the creation of a rural fire department. The steering committee also considered the overall food security of the nation. Most of the food eaten by tribal citizens is sourced from outside of the tribal jurisdiction. As climate change will impact areas all over the world, this may include varying commodity prices and changes in food prices. Therefore, along with the cultural resources that come along with community gardens, it's also thought that community gardens could help increase the food security of the nation. Like with flood risk management, Citizen Potawatomi Nation has invested significant resources studying water security issues. The steering committee acknowledged that growing water scarcity will lead to increased demand for water resources outside the jurisdiction of the nation. This will be combined with stress on the ground and surface water supplies to the tribe. In terms of the economic development systems and tribal services of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, the steering committee acknowledged that much of the economic development services of the tribe rely on outdoor recreation, and that increasingly high temperature and drought conditions could lead to less use of those services by the regional population. Further, these same conditions would increase the demand for tribal services from tribal citizens. Together, these indicate that while Citizen Potawatomi Nation is already a regional leader in a diversified economic base, economic resources will need to be dedicated to mitigating the impacts on these economic systems, as well as perhaps increased investment in the ability to offer tribal services.
Like many other tribes, the Oto-Missouri tribe is comprised of multiple units of government. These units focus on issues such as housing, water resources, emergency management, and the list goes on. Each of these entities is very busy serving its function in relation to the tribe. All of them have some interest in the area of climate change and are doing work in that area, but as is common, The opportunities are rare for these entities to come together and discuss what they're doing and how they're doing it. So the goal of this project was to bring units together to have those conversations and to identify the next steps that participating units might take to prepare for the impacts of climate change. This was a team building exercise. Groups were brought together to make presentations, to share information about their entity's function and how they were currently concerned about climate change and what they might be doing in that area. After this information sharing occurred across the agencies or entities, the goal was to come up with a collective strategy for future action. We began discussing water resources. As with all tribes in the state of Oklahoma, water resources is a critical issue. The Odo-Missouri already are affected by fire threats and spend significant resources managing those threats. They provide water to the city of Red Rock and are concerned that future limits on water supply may impact that relationship. They're also concerned about water quality as the quantity of water changes. They're concerned about fish populations and the quality of water itself. Because climate predictions for this area include increased incidence and severity of dry periods, as well as increases in the number of warm days and nights, the concerns manifest by the Odo-Missouri are very real. These will be exacerbated by increased heat and drought conditions, and so the tribe must start to think about what these impacts will do to the services provided by the tribe, as well as the natural resources that they protect. We also had conversations about emergency management. Emergency management is critical to the Oto-Missouri Nation, and they really set the standard in the region for the provision of emergency management. The increased exacerbation of severe weather in that area is of particular concern to the tribe. Climate predictions talk about the incidence of severe weather and how that will change over time. Severe weather could put visitors and staff at the tribal complex at risk. The Emergency Management Department is already considering ways to improve shelter and opportunities for safety for those members of the tribe and those who pass through tribal territory. Property acquisition is another function the Oto-Missouri are involved in. In this capacity, those who work in this field are concerned about intense heat and cold, about earthquakes, tornadoes, and droughts, all impacts that we can expect as changes in climate conditions are projected. Of particular concern is the rise in energy cost. Tribal and personal resources will have to be redirected to paying for energy if something is not done. And so there are new thoughts about how we can build our structures to higher structural standards to protect them from earthquakes, but also for increased energy efficiency. We also discussed the importance of cultural impacts. Climate change will definitely have an impact on cultural resources. This is particularly important in terms of human-made resources, but also natural resources. There is concern about the availability of plant and animal species that play important roles in culture. There's also concern about cultural sites that may become lost or unusable unless adaptation is concerned. After having these conversations in these areas, the group came together to make recommendations of next steps. In the first, the group suggested promoting ongoing discussions of short and long-term climate impacts across the departments. This means that the departments would continue to get together to have these conversations. In the second, new entities should be engaged in these conversations, including the tribal development offices. Functions are split across the tribe, and this is important for the group to understand and further explore. and to seek new partners in its effort to prepare the tribe for the impacts of climate change. The tribe is well positioned to serve as a regional provider, particularly of water and emergency management sources. As such, it might be important also for these units within the tribe to coordinate efforts to discuss climate change impacts regionally. Fourth, decisions need to be made about priorities for cultural preservation. Clearly, cultural resource preservation is critical to the longevity of the tribe. The tribe will have to make decisions at this point to decide where its priorities are and how it will go about preserving both natural and human-made structures. Tribal staff should be encouraged to develop programs that allow the staff to share this knowledge with community members. Knowledge contained doesn't get us to the place we need to be when we're dealing with climate change. Developing programs that educate members will be much more useful in long-term efforts to plan for climate change. The Oto Missouri have made an enormous step in preparing for climate change. Across the units, staff are attending workshops about the impacts of climate change and becoming very knowledgeable about how climate change will impact all of the programs and all of the units across the Oto Missouri. The next steps really include continuous coming together to have these conversations so that plans for adaptation can be made.
The Fort Sill Apache are headquartered near the town of Apache in southwest Oklahoma. While the project focused on the Oklahoma land base of the tribe, it was also very interested in the homelands in modern-day Arizona and New Mexico. The goals of the project were to internally analyze the tribe's systems and potential impacts of climate change on those systems and agencies within the tribe. To do this, the tribe established a steering committee made up of agency heads within the tribe. This steering committee not only looked at the impacts of climate change on tribal systems, but also took a look at the adaptive capacity of the tribe's governance structures. Over the course of 2015 and 2016, the steering committee met several times to discuss individual aspects of climate change and the vulnerability of the tribe. These included both learning about climate change itself, but also the water sources, water demand, emergency management of the tribe. Additionally, the steering committee discussed cultural concerns, economic development, and next steps that the tribe could conduct in order to decrease risk and vulnerability. The steering committee spent significant time discussing water resources, beginning with current stresses on their water resources system. At the main tribal complex and for most of the tribal activities, the tribe is dependent on Caddo County Rural Water District Number 3. Currently, that rural water district has very low pressure, which restricts the potential to expand at the tribal complex as well as manage fire threats. These stresses are expected not only to continue, but to likely intensify, leading to impacts both on the tribe itself at the tribal complex as well as individual tribal citizen households. In addition, the town of Apache, to the south of the main tribal complex, also struggles with water resources. This impacts both the tribe's ability to tie into the town's water system, but also impacts the housing extension that is located immediately adjacent to the town. Increasing drought conditions may exacerbate all of these existing conditions and increase demand on the tribe for tribal services by tribal citizens. In terms of the adaptive capacity of the tribe to manage its water resource system, the steering committee discussed a number of alternatives, including expanding the inflow pipe from the rural water district, conducting several hydrological studies for potential groundwater sources, storing water on site, exploring groundwater potential at the housing extension, increasing conservation at all sites, which would include demand management of water use, and increase conservation education among its members, and remaining a watchful and active stakeholder, not just in Lawton resource management plans, but in all regional conversations. In addition to water resources, the steering committee considered the ability of the tribe to provide tribal services in the midst of changing climate conditions. One of the largest concerns was whether or not the main tribal complex was under flood threat, as it is adjacent to a floodplain from a local creek. The steering committee used local knowledge of an extreme rain event in 2015 to assess the threat to the tribal complex. In that rain event, while creek water did rise, there was no serious or significant threat to the main tribal complex. Therefore, it was determined that in terms of threats to tribal services, the steering committee should focus its efforts on threats to the tribal complex, such as if water resources were to be highly restricted or if there were fire threats to the main complex. Therefore, in terms of adaptive capacity, the steering committee decided that it would be necessary to monitor any floodplain changes in the future. That would include land use changes, land contouring, additional impervious surfaces that might increase water flow to the creek and therefore threaten flood events to the main complex. Other activities would include monitoring flood insurance rate map changes and compare any evolving local knowledge of floodplain management to their experience. As with the conversation on water resources, tribal services are tied up with the overall water destiny of the tribe. The third major component the steering committee took up is the emergency management operations of the tribe. The Fort Sill Apache have a newly adopted emergency response plan that is still being evaluated. Its performance and adequacy is still being determined. Also, the steering committee acknowledges that the existing storm shelters at the tribal complex are not high capacity, which, given impacts of varying climate conditions, could increase the vulnerability of tribal citizens and visitors alike. The steering committee acknowledged that within its adaptive capacity is the ability to finalize the emergency response plan, evaluate its gaps and weaknesses, and improve it where appropriate. Also, the steering committee understood that grant applications for storm shelter expansion, not just at the tribal complex, but also within individual tribal households, should be continued. In terms of the tribe's economic development systems, the main casino supplying the tribe with revenue is located in Lawton, and like with all of Lawton, during times of drought, the casino regularly experiences stress on its water supply system. This is likely to increase given the forecasts for the region. Additionally, the tribe earns income through agriculture and grazing leases. The price fluctuations, which impact the tribe considerably, are likely to increase given the projected climate change. At the same time, these same conditions could increase the demand for tribal services at a time when it is less able to provide those services. In terms of the adaptive capacity, the steering committee acknowledged that it would be important to encourage rangeland management and agricultural practices that will better cope with the varying climate projections. In addition, new building projects should include conservation technologies, and existing buildings should undergo a retrofit for water conservation. In terms of cultural impacts from climate change, the Fort Sill Apache are already experiencing existing stress on the decreasing availability of important species. It is expected that locating these species, be they plant or animal, in the wild will become increasingly difficult. Along these lines, the use of fire in ceremonies is very important to the Fort Sill Apache. However, increasing conditions of heat and drought are likely to increase fire management requirements and stress on those systems. As I mentioned before, the Fort Sill Apache were not only interested in the impacts of climate change on their base in Oklahoma, but also on what the projections mean for the homelands in modern-day New Mexico and Arizona. These areas are already the hottest and driest region in the United States and are projected to become even hotter and drier. In some cases, the Southwest is expected to experience extreme heat and drought events. These projections may require significant adjustment to future plans in the homelands and underscore the need for planning for projects that account for increased heat and decreasing water resources throughout the region. In terms of the adaptive capacity for these cultural impacts, the steering committee suggested that already the Fort Sill Apache were experimenting with new plant species that could stand in for traditional ones used in ceremonial life. The steering committee acknowledged that the tribe has always been entrepreneurial in its search for resources and will continue that as a tribal ethic, but also noted that specific activities related to greenhouses or conservation efforts were likely going to be important. In terms of adaptive capacity in the homelands, new initiatives should consider in the construction plans and land use planning ways to minimize the impacts of increasing heat and to be as efficient in its water use as possible.
Wichita and affiliated tribes. Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. My name is Dr. Megan Wieters at the University of Oklahoma College of Architecture, Division of Regional and City Planning. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the work that we did this past year with the Wichita and affiliated tribes. The Wichita and affiliated tribes are located in central Oklahoma. Their tribal boundary covers many areas, including 4 counties, Coweta County, Canadian County, Grady County, and Blaine counties. And in this region of central Oklahoma in general, we are experiencing more hot days. 7 hot days per season are the average, but we're actually projected to increase to 30 days of the hottest temperatures per season annually. And what this meant as a concern for the Wichita and affiliated tribes was the idea that this has an impact on their elders as well as people with some health concerns. And how do they provide for the future additional assistance for keeping their homes cool, having backup generators, and assistance with utility bills. Additionally, related to climate change is we have an increased amount of heavy precipitation. What does this have to do with? The area is that we have an increased need or concern of the flood drought cycle, where we go through long periods of drought and then ultimately are impacted by heavy precipitation that causes rapid flowing water over the earth, which can be dangerous, but it also increases extreme amounts of erosion. This can impact public infrastructure, but it also affects cultural resources. And we're going to talk about those specific impacts related to the Wichita tribe shortly. One of the key components that the Wichita and affiliated tribes were interested in addressing was the idea of how do they monitor and the changing landscapes in their area to be able to decide what the prioritization of their issues within their community occurs. So this was partially our work was to build the capacity of their own staff to understand and be able to use GIS in a meaningful way. We set up their system within their office. And what is GIS? Geographic Information System is just simply a way of mapping these resources through inventories, through data. And in this case, we wanted to pay attention to climate change impacts in the community. Some of the particular notes that they wanted to address were things like trees, erosion factors, lake levels, and impacts on their cultural resources. So in the example here on this slide is moving through essentially hypothetical data, showing you trees at one data point back in time, hypothetically in 1999. And then over time, it's showing you the loss and gain in some cases of trees and in health and diversity. And what this can do as a tool, GIS, is it's allowing you to visually see where you're potentially having negative impacts or potentially even positive impacts on efforts that you're doing to try and address the area. And this is something that the Wichita and affiliated tribes were interested in doing, is being able to simply document where the erosion was occurring and how fast was it impacting or moving further up in terms of the lake levels and things like that. And then in terms of trees, they ultimately have a goal of potentially documenting their trees and understanding what the loss of trees might be happening or the health of the trees within their community and their region might occur. So in the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about specifically the Wichita and affiliated tribe kind of projects that they're the most interested in at the moment. So what you're looking at here is simply an aerial view of the Wichita and affiliated boundary, and we're going to zoom in to look at the sort of a particular area. So you can see that this is just the area that's near the headquarters. And there are various things that are important at the headquarters. One is a powwow ceremonial area that's experiencing increased erosion and that they have to repair multiple times a year because of the erosion that's occurring. And so this is something that they want to pay attention to and understand if there's other things that they can do to potentially reduce that increased maintenance cost for the safety of the dancers in the ceremonial land. And that's located within the headquarters area. But the other project that they're of concern, that they're noticing that increased erosion and loss of habitat and loss of trees has impacted the cemetery. So in the image towards the corner, where there's a yellow boundary and a blue boundary, the yellow boundary is highlighting where the erosion at a higher elevation to the blue boundary below is, and it's sort of sloughing essentially the red earth clay is kind of sloughing down the hill slowly, and it's lost a lot of the trees and vegetation, so it's increasing its erosion. So as we have increased precipitation, that's eroding that area and impacting what's below, and what's below is a cemetery, a very old cemetery, and the tribe is interested in documenting using GIS and as well as GPS units to document all of the headstones and the conditions, as well as document the erosion that's going on to determine what kinds of things that they should address as we have increased erosion from the flood drought cycle over time. The key things that were discussed with the Wichita and affiliated tribes that were increasing their impacts because of climate change were floods, increased number of events that were potentially creating problems for some of their elders or other members of the tribe that were a little more remote areas, meaning that there might be only one road into that area. Erosion could impact that road, but it also could impact community and cultural structures. Additionally, droughts, which are very much tied to floods, there's an increased number and duration of floods in the areas, as well as droughts in the Oklahoma region, which has an impact on these same structures, both cultural and community-based issues, as well as infrastructure. Extreme heat is very prevalent in Oklahoma, and most of this was related to their public health division and health concerns for their elders and with compromised health, inability to hold outdoor ceremonies. These are slowly moving indoors because it's too hot to hold some of these ceremonies outside. Severe storms. Some of the concerns were evacuation routes. Do they have multiple ways in and out of an area for their isolated residents? How do they address temporary outages? Tornadoes, increasing the ability for people to get to a safe place to shelter during these events, increasing the notification and coordination with other jurisdictions. And ice storms related to severe storms and tornadoes, making sure people have safe spaces, that they have evacuation routes, and that isolated residents have potentially generators or other kinds of things to provide interim assistance, as well as clearing ice and snow and debris. These are all concerns that are probably relevant for many communities, but these were specifically the ones that were called out for the Wichita and affiliated tribes. So some of the things that they wanted to do related to all of those climate change issues were included under their conservation programs to increase their education programs specifically for children, to get children to understand ways that they can do more conservation and help their own families do increased conservation. And this is for water quality as well as quantity for the community. Public health, one of the key ones was to be able to have more storm shelters available, whether it's community-based for a little node of housing or individual shelters. Emergency management, their key focus was to make sure that they were coordinated with area, county, hazard mitigation plans, as well as the idea of making sure that they had available additional generators to address remote people that might be a little bit more isolated during storm events, where they might not have power for a couple of weeks and they may need assistance for both food and medications that need to be refrigerated, things like that, as well as debris removal. And for the transportation, being able to remove simply barriers on key routes, as well as addressing potentially where they might have some isolated residents. Is there a means to provide a secondary evacuation route just in case? And then finally, one of the major focuses of this work was environmental and cultural resource management. This area, we focused in on looking at how to monitor, using GIS, some of the key issues that they're concerned about that are being impacted by climate change. And this includes monitoring lake levels over time and being able to show that to others that things are changing and we might need to address it in some way. Mapping and documenting erosion at all tribal cemeteries, ceremonial lands, and any other infrastructure that's being impacted by increased erosion. And then the idea would be to also map and document over quite a long time, because there's quite a lot of trees, the variety and health and location of trees in the community, to identify if they have an issue with deforestation or any kinds of health issues related to trees for their community. And this is the major focus of our work with the tribe, is to focus on these vulnerabilities and then talk about initial ways that they could address those issues of climate change and how do they adapt to those issues as they come about.
Representatives of the Kaw Nation decided that this project would be useful in helping them understand the impact of climate change on Kaw Lake and the waters feeding it. As a part of this project, we explored regional strategies for the management of Kaw Lake. The approach for this project was a little different than the others. Its focus was on scientific research that understands and appreciates how climate change is in fact impacting Kaw Lake. This was followed by an exploration of best practices for regional water management. Kaw Lake is shared by a number of players, not just the Odo-Missouri tribe. The Odo actually has a very small share in Kaw Lake. However, it is an important cultural and recreational resource in their area. So it is important to them that as other users get rights to use water in this lake, that the lake retains its vitality as an ecosystem. The Kaw Nation has several concerns about the long-term health and viability of Kaw Lake. The first concern relates to sediments and pollutants. The headwaters that feed Kaw Lake are often changed by the way that the land is managed and moved up to the north of the lake. This is problematic because it has brought a lot of sediment and pollutant into the lake, changing the water quality. As water does not flow as significantly through the lake as it once did, this has caused a dwindling fish population and is problematic, as the lake is an important recreational food source. There has also been an interest in developing a water pipeline to the city of Enid, which is significantly far away from Kaw Lake. However, there are not a lot of reservoir systems capturing water in this area of Oklahoma. Because of that, there have been discussions about how another user in the pipeline for Kaw Lake may impact the amount of water that is available in the lake. As we've already seen with sedimentation, the less fresh water that flows through Kaw Lake, the decline in water vitality and fish population. The lake is also suffering from an invasive zebra mussel population, which has to be controlled at some point. After taking a look at the water quality and quantity in Kaw Lake, we had a short discussion about the impacts of climate change on Kaw Lake. Increased heat, increased drought, all of these activities that will come with climate change will have an impact on both the water quality and quantity in Kaw Lake, And so it becomes even more important for those who have interest, current legal interest as well as future interest in the lake, to have a conversation about how to keep this very important water source vital. The first next step then is to explore best practices in the regional management of water resources. This is critical, and the Kaw Nation is ready to have the conversation with both tribal partners and municipal partners, as well as the state, to come up with a water management plan for Kaw Lake, which seems critical as it is vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Part of this may be considering the creation of a regional water board to make formal decisions regarding the use of water in Kaw Lake.
The purpose of this video was to discuss regional themes coming out of 5 climate change vulnerability assessments with tribes based in Oklahoma. The tribes included the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, the Otoe-Missouri Tribe, the Fort Sill Apache, the Wichita and affiliated tribes, and the Kaw Nation. And while many of the details of these projects have been discussed, there were several key concepts that came out of all the projects. These included both the reality and the potential of tribal leadership in the region. Second was the importance of regional interdependency between not just tribes but also other regional actors and governments. Third, tribes face significant internal interdependency, whereby it was found that different divisions or organizations within the tribal structure need to work together to create more comprehensive threat assessments and adaptations. Fourth is that in all cases, there will need to be significant internal investments to build capacity both for threat monitoring and for adaptation planning. Fifth is that across the board there are now and will continue to be significant threats to the cultural heritage of these tribes, and that critical reflection is required both to safeguard existing cultural resources and plan for the future. Lastly, there are several threats that all the tribes were concerned with, including future water sources for household consumption, firefighting, and economic and agricultural production, the quality of surface and groundwater supplies, as well as increased threats from flooding, drought, and extreme weather events. Taken together, the tribes were concerned about their own internal ability to manage these threats, both for emergency management, also for long-range planning. We thank you for taking the time to view this video. We hope it has been helpful. If you have any questions, please contact me. I am John Harris at the Regional and City Planning Program at the University of Oklahoma. My email is johnchoharris@ou.edu. Thank you.